Remains of Edith Finch is the first thing you see. Then the back of a boat, some flowers, and a casted arm holding a book that says Edith Finch on the cover. Curiosity, but also a tinge of sadness. This is the tone and experience here. Among any of the games that I've covered in this short series, this one most closely resembles a storybook, something that you might read as a young adult, discovering it for the first time and not being able to put it down. This happened with me when I was a kid, having discovered the My Teacher is an Alien book series. Every one of those books I had to read from start to finish. This was the exact same way for me. Such a well done story, so much that I've played through it a handful of times now and never do get tired of it. The emotions are just as real and raw every time. The parts that punch you in the gut still hit the same every time, and it's by far the best story experience I've ever had. A better way to describe it would be akin to when you go to see one of those movies released over the last year that a lot of folks say could easily be in the running to win the all-important Oscar for Best Picture. Sometimes they can, in fact, be something you regret spending the time of your life it took to sit through the thing. If it's done well, though, it can almost have a lasting effect on your life. Not in the way that you become a different person or decide to make a serious lifestyle change, but in the way that it just never really leaves your mind. You're thinking about it all the time, but if you see it again or someone brings it up, the memory of how it made you feel when you first watched comes right back and you experience it all again. It also clearly meets and handily surpasses all your expectations you have going in. Those are some of the best ones in life, though, when you find yourself saying something along the lines of, I thought it was going to be good, but I didn't think it was going to be that good. Another personal example I can give of this is when I went to see Forrest Gump. I had an interest in it, but wasn't super dedicated to the idea of watching it. I was taken to the theater by some family, and I just remember feeling surprised more and more throughout the movie, and when it was all finally over, after the credits and we were on our way back to the car, immediately wanting to rewatch it again, and we hadn't even left the parking lot yet. This is Edith Finch, a game that reviewed well, but not everyone was on board, as a lot of Oscar-winning movies are. Am I really trying to compare Edith Finch to an Oscar-winning movie? Actually, yes, I am. That's how strongly I feel about this game. Something that makes you feel the entire range of emotions, from smiles to tears and everything in between, deserves some kind of high award such as an Oscar. Especially something that wasn't made by one of the large and well-established AAA studios. This was made by a smaller group of people who had something they wanted to say. Something not made, rather, but crafted and story-worthy of the gold man on a stand. Before we get into the story and spoiler warnings, I want to get some final thoughts in about the Walking Simulator Stigma out of the way, because I really just want to spend the rest of this video talking about the story itself. With these last two videos, Stanley and Gone Home, I have tried my best to illustrate why games like these really shouldn't be hit with the negativity, the stigma, that Walking Simulator has attached to it. All of these games were crafted by people who cared about what they were saying more than how they were saying it. They are essentially using the medium of video games to tell their story instead of creating a gameplay experience and trying to write a story around that. Fun is not the top priority here, it's the story. That in itself can be fun, yes, but making something that can really affect people is something that gets overlooked, especially when it's not something that's widely accepted by the general gaming community. All of these games received good reviews from the critics, but they weren't wholly adopted by gamers, which, in some cases of a critical darling, they ended up as odd ducks. Looking at the three of them individually, the Stanley Parable allows for player choice that can affect the ending outcome of the game, offers a level of interactivity, and responds as the player makes these choices. The decisions made here can greatly affect the outcome of the game, which can vary quite a bit. Gone Home offers a very emotionally touching story, an entire house to explore and interact with. Sam's journal entries are voice acted, very well, and does a really good job of world building and helping the player feel like it's the mid-90s all over again, providing that the player remembers what it was like back then. Finally, we have What Remains of Edith Finch. This game has a plethora of interactivity, different forms of gameplay, entirely depending upon which chapter of the game the player is working on. It builds an amazing world to experience the story in, and generally envelops the player inside of the world, so it really suspends the disbelief better than the rest of the games I've mentioned so far. Essentially, what I'm getting at here is none of these games really do fall under the heading of Walking Simulator. Thinking about just going outside and taking a walk entails simply that, taking a walk. Looking around at scenery, maybe listening to some music, that's really about it. Unless, of course, there's some other kind of walking culture I'm not aware of at all. This may entirely be possible, but it's also entirely beyond the point. None of these games are as limited as this. They are far more than scenery, far more than a stroll with a soundtrack. These are stories. These are heart and a want to make something that leaves a lasting impression on people. They are a different way to take in a narrative and should be considered as a delivery method more and more when planning out a story for a game, which, as we found out, can be as varied as some of the genres these games are made for in the first place. From a slightly confused narrator to a lost and confused teenager, all the way to this amazing piece of interactive art. This is the most amazing story experience I have ever played and has definitely become a regular part of my game library. Allow me to explain this story in a good bit of detail with the usual spoiler warnings, only this time I'm going to be pretty strict on this one. So, if you haven't played this game, do not watch this video past this point because I will be spending the rest of it talking about the story of the Finches in detail and length, and this is a story that is really best experienced first within the context of the game itself. Even if for some reason you don't want to play the game yourself, I am planning on releasing the full playthrough of this game without commentary, so if you wish, you can check that out, then come back to this video. Now that I have gotten that out of the way, as I stated earlier, the story starts on the back of a boat with what appears to be a journal sat in the lap of an as yet unnamed character. You open the journal and a female voice begins to read what's written in it, out loud. It turns out the voice you are hearing is a young woman by the name of Edith Finch, who has recently inherited the home in which she grew up. She is on the way to the house, which she hasn't been back since the night they left, which many things are implied about but won't be cleared up until later. You are finding these things out in really unique ways as the dialogue appears on the screen, not like some boring bland subtitle, but in a way that really enhances the way the story is being told up to this point. The house itself is also a real character in this story. Not in any kind of malicious way or anything, it's just unique, full of additions and blemishes and other kinds of things that almost make it feel human somehow. You first see the house in the distance, staring through some old growth pine trees and an almost plasticine looking forest. Making your way down the road and off onto a trail, after looking in a mailbox that looks exactly like the house, which is a cute touch in my honest opinion, the developers here really do an amazing job of making this place look beautiful like it really is in the Pacific Northwest. This is more of the kind of world building I had mentioned in the previous two parts of this series, but here it's done so well, arguably better than any of the other two in a good number of ways. It really is immersive and does a great job of making you feel like you're there, more so than a VR headset, I would argue. Walking through the trail, you begin to find out how the house actually makes Edith feel. She's afraid of the house, and not just that, a lot of things have happened to the family surrounding the house. It's a bit hard to explain now what is really going on, so we'll just continue on. Edith crawls through the doggy door and into the garage and the house itself. You come upon the kitchen and dining room, and some of the things that happened on Edith's last night in the house begin to be touched upon, as they are good setups for what will be elaborated upon later. You pass the library, which is also important to the story, as it's stated that, according to Edith Sr., every Finch that ever lived is buried in the library. Pretty weird, but then again, so are the Finches. This is where Edith first notices that the doors are sealed up and there are peepholes drilled into all of the sealed doors. This came after Milton, Edith's brother, went missing. Dawn decided to seal up all the doors, and Edith Sr., out of revenge, drilled peepholes in the sealed doors so they could be looked inside of, much like some kind of a mausoleum. Edith heads upstairs, that is the only way to go, and into the only open bedroom on the second floor. Nothing can be found here except for a book with a lock on it. No, this isn't some kind of super secret journal, but really an entirely new way to explore the house, secret little passages and tunnels, seemingly made for small kids. You squeeze through the small opening and into Molly's room. Looking around, the only thing that seems unusual is what appears to be a memorial to Molly with her date of birth and death, along with a diary with Molly's name on it. This is where you, as the player, finally start to figure out how this game tells its story. It's delivered through the individual stories from each member of the family that has lived and died in and around the house. These take the form of journal entries mostly, which some are notes on legal pads, a poem written on a cylinder, a bunch of divorce papers, photos, and even an old-style cartoon flip book. This is another way Edith Finch shares a unique form of storytelling. More on this at the conclusion. The first individual story that Edith is pulled into, in a way, is Molly, Edith Sr.'s firstborn daughter. She's only 10 as she begins to read her own diary out to Edith. This is also where you find out about how tragic the story of the Finches is. Molly died when she was only 10 years old, and she's not the only one to die young either. Molly has a very unique story. She's sent to bed without dinner and locked in a room for misbehaving. As she is lying in bed, she decides that she is very, very hungry and begins to eat everything in sight. Gerbil food, which really amounts to a carrot, toothpaste, what looks like a possible toxic berry, and still she is hungry. What happens next is a bit unusual, as are most of the stories here. Molly then sees a bird outside her window and proceeds to turn into a cat. Yes, you may be confused, as I was when I played this. Really, there is no clear explanation as to how or why this happened. It just is. As Molly climbs and jumps around trying to catch this bird, she eventually catches it and then turns into an owl, swooping around looking for rabbits to eat. After eating a couple of these, then Molly becomes a shark, then some kind of tentacled monster eating sailors on a boat, only to slither into a drain pipe, up and out of the toilet, and back under Molly's bed. It's never implied or even explained how Molly dies, so one can only assume that it has something to do with what she ate that night. Once Edith is done reading Molly's diary, she pulls out her own family tree and begins to fill it in based on the things she finds. This is how the player can track their progress by making sure they haven't missed any family members. Once finished with Molly's story, Edith makes her way out of the window, much like Molly Cat did, and into the room of Edith Sr., the one you were named after and also your great-grandmother. Edith Jr. then discovers that Edith Sr. was a bit of a storyteller. This is evidenced by the stories of a dragon killing her husband Sven, but it was actually a slide in the shape of a dragon, but it clearly seemed better to tell it the other way. Another piece of evidence is the story of a mole man living under the house. This is certainly not true, as Edith will find out later. What is found in this room, though, is a bit of Finch history, as told through one of those old viewfinders with the disc in it, like the kind we had when we were kids. According to history, Odin Finch was tired of a supposed family curse, and set the family home on top of a barge, essentially, and sailed it away in search of a new life. They made it all the way across the ocean until 40-foot-tall waves off the coast of Washington sank the house. Well, not completely, as the top of it is always visible from the shoreline. This is all Edith finds out from her great-grandmother's room, and Edith Sr. doesn't really have her backstory fully fleshed out as the other family members do. Once done with the Viewmaster, Edith then finds a door leading into a very, very pink bathroom, with very pink shag carpet, which in a bathroom is a real hygienic mistake, and another secret book entrance to another small passageway. This one, however, is a pop-up book, which continues to grow the different ways in which the story and these stories are played out. Shoving an office chair out of her way, Edith makes her way back into the room of two twin brothers, Sam and Calvin. It's obvious the one half of the room looks pretty normal, albeit with an outdoors camo-type theme, and the other side is roped off completely. You will come to find out that this is Calvin's side of the room. Unclipping the exhibit-style rope, you notice that this side of the room is more themed towards space and flight, that type of thing. Crawling up the steps, you encounter a space helmet with a handwritten letter inside of it. The letter is from Calvin's brother Sam. You learned that all Calvin ever wanted to do was fly. He was one of those kids who always fantasized about swinging all the way around the bar, or branch in this case. Edith is again transported into the story, right into the shoes of Calvin, who would have been her great-uncle. The goal here is to swing back and forth, much like you would do in real life, to get that swing higher and higher and finally all the way around. This, of course, has the effect of eventually sending young Calvin hurtling through the air and flying. He got his wish, and in doing so, also has another young Finch to pass. Calvin is 11 when he passes, just 1 year older than Molly, even though the two deaths were separated by quite some time, 1947 and 1961. Back into another little tunnel, Edith emerges from what seems to be some kind of a chest in a Barbara's room. Barbara was a child star who was famous for her scream and thus found herself in horror movies. Once she hit puberty, though, her scream and her stardom were gone. She ended up as a waitress, which is evident from the uniform in the room. Edith also finds, instead of a diary or a journal, a cult pulp type of magazine, which tells the story of how Barbara died. This smaller story is narrated by the game's version of the Crypt Keeper, and plays out like an interactive comic book. It seems what happened was, her boyfriend at the time was trying to get her scream back to where it used to be, tried to scare her, that didn't go over so well, and then she was assaulted by a man with a hook on his hand, and then thrown a morbid surprise party by a bunch of movie monsters. The only thing truly left behind for them to bury was just her ear. This not only affected Barbara, obviously, since she was dead, but her younger brother Walter, who was hiding under the bed, afraid of the monsters in the house. During this story, Edith finds out that there is a way to get into the basement, and that comes in the form of a music box that Edith found when she first entered the house. The secret there is to simply keep turning the winder until the key pops out. This is the first place Edith goes after Barbara's room, the basement. Usually in most games, the basement is the setting for some real horror type of stuff to go down, but not in this case. This is more an exploratory type of trip. Eventually, Edith comes to a dead end, the fridge that was in Barbara's story, but once the door is opened, it actually leads to a small underground bunker. This is where Walter came to live after Barbara had died. Walter decided that he needed to get as far away as possible and ended up down there for 30 years, living the same day over and over, eating the same foods over and over, because of the monster he was convinced of that was right outside his door. Eventually, though, as is learned from the note Walter left on the legal pad, that he had eventually had enough of living the same day over and over. So he went further down into his bunker, grabbed a sledgehammer, and broke free, quite literally, through the wall and out into what he thought was a new life for himself. Just as he wrote that he could feel the sun on his face. This is one of the more tragic stories in Edith Finch. Poor Walter had finally gotten over his fears, finally decided to get out there and live life, instead of being afraid of it, and was struck down by a train for his trouble. Seems incredibly unfair for someone who finally saw the light. The next sequence is pretty meaningful and deep, as you, the player, find out a few more things about the family, revelations that Edith has made about this curse that the family has dealt with, and finally, well, I'll let her spell it out.
Only one of us left. Or maybe two. I thought it was time I heard the stories for myself. And found out what happened to everyone else. But now I'm worried the stories themselves might be the problem. Maybe we believed so much in a family curse, we made it real. I don't know if I should even be writing this. Maybe it'd be better if all this just died with me. But I thought you should know about your family. And the history you're a part of. Though to be honest, I feel as lost as you probably do right now. I think the people in these stories believed them, for what that's worth. Looking back on it now, if she told me there was going to be so much climbing, I never would have come when I was 22 weeks pregnant.
As the player, you find out that Edith is 22 weeks pregnant, and she has been writing this journal for her unborn child. This really explains why she has been writing this and whom she has been speaking to this entire time. Not you, the player, but her baby. This takes Edith into her grandpa Sam's room, Calvin's brother. Edith can clearly see that he was a serviceman, always throwing himself at death, seemingly trying to avoid it himself. Sam is Dawn's father, Dawn being Edith's mom. This is explained in pictures that Sam had taken of a hunting trip he had taken Dawn on. This was also the last hunting trip Sam would go on, as the deer that had appeared was shot by Dawn, was not quite dead yet, and kicked Sam off of a cliff. Really makes Dawn seem like, aside from Edith Sr., the one who had lost the most. Edith continues on into the room of three siblings, Dawn, Gus, and Gregory. The first one to be looked at is Gregory. This is the other one of the two most tragic stories in all of Edith Finch. This is the youngest Finch to pass, as he was just one, tragically in the bathtub. This is also where the game shines the brightest, because Giant Sparrow seems to have made an event that is so tragic, seems so beautiful in the way that it was done, with dancing bath toys, the music, and the general sense of wonder that Gregory is experiencing all of this in. He is never in pain, never suffering, just smiling and laughing the whole time. Again, very sad, and is truly a somber note for the Finch family as a whole. It's also a somber note for the game and the story. It's positively right there with Walter's story, as real emotional pinpricks that stand out for me, as they may for other people watching this. It's even so powerful that it is inferred that this may have been the reason Sam and Kay got a divorce in the first place, which there is also evidence for as Edith is reading about Gregory on divorce papers. This is so impactful that it's actually a bit difficult to spend a lot of time talking about it, as I feel it's one of those things that lingers, that you kind of just stare at in a speechless way. Another amazing example of how this so closely resembles a storybook and less a walking sim. The next story Edith comes upon is merely a bed away and takes the form of a poem written about Gregory's older brother Gus. Reading the poem on the cylinder, Edith is transported to the day that his dad, Sam, got remarried. The wedding was on the beach behind the house, and Gus took it upon himself to fly his kite that day. This is possibly the best example that this story gives of finding a new way to deliver the actual text. Not subtitles, but as if the words were actually written in a book somewhere. It kind of reminds me of old Disney from when I was a kid. The kite flies through the words to unjumble them or flip them around to reveal new words. This really feels like an interactive book, which in my mind can never be a bad thing. After a time, a storm blows in and the kite begins to take chairs, balloons, and other small things from the reception along the way with it, creating some sort of awful streamer behind it. As the Congo line of strangeness can't seem to get any longer, the wind catches the entire tent and blows it towards Gus, insinuating that this is the way that Gus passed. This is sad in a different way, as Gus was defiant, being adamantly against having a stepmom, even going as far as to flip his dad off at one point. Instead of getting what he wanted, he ended up becoming just another chapter in the Finch family curse. Moving on from this room, Edith then comes up, literally, on the section of the house that had been built for her part of the family. Her brothers, Louis, Milton, Edith, and her mom, Dawn. Her brother Milton is the one who had a castle built for him on his birthday. Well, Edith Sr. did it for him, but he got a castle nonetheless. This is one of the shortest stories in Edith Finch, but it's also one of the most unique. The story here is that Milton disappeared behind a magic door that he had painted inside of a castle. He painted it, opened it, stepped inside, and was never heard from again. Edith finds this out while going through a genuine flipbook, like an old-style hand-drawn and animated flipbook. You can even control the speed, which is also a really cool, neat little... Speaking of neat little touches, I want to take a quick trip in the weeds here to talk about how many of those Giant Sparrow has managed to put into this game. From pop-up books that you can interact with, to dissolving letters like words on a page, a heavy stylized version of a comic book that makes up Barbara's story, using an old-school viewfinder to tell a very brief version of the story of how the Finches originally came over to this country, a telescope of sorts that allows you to look out into the sea, and, well, the old house just sitting there, jutting out from the waves. There's just so many things that they have done to make this a really unique experience. Again, much more than something you just walk around and look at. This is not a museum, nor should it be viewed as something similar. This brings me on to the best example of how unique Edith Finch is, and it's also the last individual story we are presented with here, Lewis. This is another one of the more tragic tales in this book, as Lewis just fades away into his own mind as a result of losing his brother and a majority of the rest of his family. His room is a converted boat. You can immediately tell that Lewis uses things to try to escape reality for however long he needs. There are glass pipes in his room, black light posters, a gaming PC, obvious when you notice the highlighted WASD keys, and also very proud of the fact that his father, Dawn's now deceased husband, was Indian. He was really lost in his own mind until his mom was able to get him a job at the cannery, hence all of the cans of salmon down in the kitchen. The cannery is also where we pick up the story of Lewis, which, as I stated before, is one of the most unique things to happen, not just in this story, but in gaming in general. The story begins by Edith reading a letter from Lewis's counselor addressed to Edith's mom. The counselor goes into detail about where Lewis was when he first came to see her, how she tried to help, and eventually how he came to pass. This is where the transition to the cannery takes place. You, as Edith, are controlling Lewis, well, one of his hands anyway, as he grabs one fish after the other, pulling him into the slicer to slice their heads off and prepare them for the eventual canning process. This is until something new comes into play here, as in his mind, Lewis is creating a whole different world where you are using the WASD keys to control where the small version of Lewis is walking, or using your right hand on the mouse to control Lewis's chopping hand. I don't know about any of you watching, but I have never seen anything like this in any other game I've played. This really adds to the idea that Lewis is really conflicted. He both wants to be a good worker, but doing that kind of job really leads the mind to wandering and creating an entirely new world where he is the king, the man, if you will. His fantasy keeps growing both in scale and complexity until you can't even see the table that the fish are coming in on anymore. You still see the fish in the gloved hand, but nothing else, save for the fantasy playing out in front of you. This is also something that is very relatable, as we have all had some kind of mindless job where we wished we were doing something else, that we were somewhere else. Some of us may have even taken it to this kind of level, but not as much as Lewis did. He got to the point where he believed that King Lewis was the real one, and that the Lewis in the cannery chopping fish is the fabrication. He leans into this so much that he believes he will officially be crowned as the new king. As he bends down to accept his crown, well, it becomes another sad ending to another Finch flame. This is the last individual story that Edith reads, as the rest of the family tree is filled in. The only thing missing is for Edith to tell the story of what happened on that last night. That can't happen, though, until we climb into the highest room in the house at the very tippy top, which is Edith's room. She crawls on the bed as though she were still a child and writes in her journal the details of what took place. The night began with packing, which Edith Sr. just watched. They all sat down at the dining room table, and, since you've stuck with me this far, I'll let you see how it all comes to an end for yourself, as I really can't do the ending of this story justice.
That whole last day, Edie just watched us pack and didn't say a word. Until supper, when she raised her glass and said,
"To our final night together, and all our final nights apart."
Grandma, you know what I said about alcohol. Some of your medications are very
Edith,
specific.
I left a present for you in the hallway. Why don't you go open it? The grown-ups have to argue now.
I'm sorry, you're right. We're all leaving tomorrow. Let's just enjoy our last...
I'm not leaving.
Edith, you're excused.
The power had been shut off that morning, but Edie always had plenty of candles. When my mom sealed the library, I don't think she knew about the other entrance, or that Edie had a key to it.
That thing you're afraid of isn't going to end when you leave the house. Edith has a right to know these stories.
My children are dead because of your stories. I think it's best if Edith and I leave tonight. We'll have the nursing home send a van for you in the morning. Okay?
Dear Edith, there's so many stories I wish I could tell you, but there's only time for one. This is about what happened on the night you were born. That night, the tide went way, way out. It was the first and last time I ever saw the old house aground. There'd been an earthquake out in the middle of the ocean. They called it the lowest tide in 1,000 years. God, it smelled awful. You know, I've seen that house every day of my life. But I never thought I'd go back to it. When the fog rolled in, I lost my way. I got turned around. For a while, I wandered. I started seeing things. Things I'd forgotten had ever existed. But when I saw them, they felt like old friends. That night, a lot of things came back to me. Or maybe I came back to them. Things I can't explain, but that I need you to try and...
Edith, what are you doing in here?
It's mine.
Edith!
Mom, you're gonna rip it! Let go! I kicked and screamed, but Mom dragged me to the car. I never saw Great-Grandma Edie again. The next morning, the van came to pick her up, but she was already gone. After that, we moved around a lot. We both tried to make the best of it. A few years went by. My mom didn't like to talk about it, but she started getting sick a lot. The rest happened pretty quickly. She got better for a while, and then she didn't. And then I was alone. The last Finch left alive. Until I found out about you. I'm still not sure what to tell you about all this. If we lived forever, maybe we'd have time to understand things. But as it is, I think the best we can do is try to open our eyes. And appreciate how strange and brief all of this is. This journal was supposed to be for you. but now I hope you'll never see it. I just want to meet you and tell you all these stories myself. But I guess if you're reading this now, things didn't work out that way. This is where your story begins. I'm sorry I won't be there to see it. It's a lot to ask, but I don't want you to be sad that I'm gone. I want you to be amazed that any of us ever had a chance to be here at all. Good luck.
And there you have it. One of the most beautiful stories ever presented, and it's in the format of this amazing game. We've come all the way around to find out who was holding the book at the beginning and what the flowers are for, Edith's son, presenting them at her grave, another victim of the Finch family curse. The credits roll, achievements pop, and this is the end of the amazingly heartfelt story presented in the format of a game. Not a walking sim, but a full, fleshed-out game. Just like Stanley and Gone Home, the heart of the people who made this game is on full display here, as is the creativity, and to call these games simply walking sims is kind of a slap in the face to all those fine people who made these stories for us to enjoy and for time we will never forget. Thank you so very much for joining me on this journey through these games, and I do sincerely hope that you maybe see games like this through a bit of a different lens. You can take the time to appreciate how different these all are, not just from the rest of the games on the market, but from each other as well. Thank you very much for watching not only this video, but the entirety of this trilogy and watching all the way to the end. Think of this as a special Easter egg just for you. If you liked this video, give some thought to subscribing, and if you really enjoyed it and wish to support the channel, I have a link for that below. Also, thank you very much to IG Gary the Borgie for writing contributions, and to all of the amazing devs behind this game. Go out and play them. Until next time, folks. Until then.